Fossils, The Stones Cry Out by Mike Thaman. Any copyrighted videos, images, or text are used under the guidelines of fair use in Title 17-107 of the U.S. Copyright Code. Such material remains the copyright of the original holder and is used here for the purposes of education, comparison, and criticism only. As I mentioned in my previous slide series, Design or Chance, one of the problems with evolution is that the first thing they tried to do was to set aside what had previously been believed about creation, the fall, and the flood. The two verses on the screen are just two of many that show how clear the Bible is on the issue of creation and the flood. There were three complaints against the clear teaching of the Bible on creation. Number one is they weren't science because they couldn't be observed. Number two, they relied on a supernatural explanation, God. And perhaps the biggest one is they implied a God who had judged sin in the fall and in the flood. And as I pointed out in that previous series, with the intention to replace what was believed, the theory was developed next before many observations had been collected. The substitute gods of time and chance were given supernatural powers to accomplish all that we see. Vast ages were given the ability to do things that could never actually be observed. After billions of years, everything came from an initial Big Bang. Random chance was thought to be able to overcome the laws of probability. Random mutations were believed to produce an apparent design in plants and animals, without the need to rely on a designer. Non-living chemicals could gain complexity, eventually becoming living things, forming more complex organisms, and even eventually becoming man. Vast geologic ages replaced the catastrophic nature of the fossil record. And as a search for evidence began to support these all-encompassing replacement theories, some evidence began to emerge that seemed to support it. Astronomers found evidence that the universe is expanding, an initial support for the Big Bang. As we've studied living things, we have found many similar features between groups. As we've studied the fossil record, we found that from bottom to top, the general order is simple to complex. But remember, time and chance were chosen to replace God as an explanation for the design we see in the natural world. When evidence begins to be found that doesn't fit, a just so explanation is advanced so that the theory is never entirely rejected. In astronomy with the Big Bang theory, when later observations didn't fit the basic theory, inflation was proposed to explain away the problems. With the discovery of very unusual features in animals, convergent evolution was proposed to explain these features in completely unrelated animal groups. And of course in geology, where index fossils are used to date the rocks by the fossils that are found in them, sometimes later discoveries have the laters out of order. As we've begun to sequence DNA, we are making incredible discoveries about how complex the DNA molecule is. We're being told that much of this genetic material was just going along for the ride until just the right time when it was able to express itself. This was supposed to explain how living things could suddenly gain important features or organs that are tremendous enhancements for their survival. And of course, the fossil record was supposed to collaborate this by showing many sequences of developments and later extinctions of life. This results in a theory that cannot be falsified because it evolves to fit the evidence. This is why the Big Bang is still the only game in town for astronomers, and the tree of life is constantly being reorganized as new things are discovered. And this is why both the ages and the sequence of fossils is constantly being reorganized as new fossils are uncovered. Think of how many times the human ancestry lines have been changed just in your lifetime. In trying to turn a negative into a positive, evolutionists call this the self-correcting nature of science. In other words, that science corrects itself as new discoveries come forward. Failing to find mechanisms to explain how evolution could occur, evolutionists turned to fossils to prove that evolution had occurred, and showed the pattern of simple to complex that the theory of evolution had proposed. Critical to this shift in thinking was the use of enormous amounts of time to make something that is impossible to not only seem possible, but to actually appear likely to occur. Let's look at fossils from some evolutionary materials and see if the theory is supported, or if the fossils have something entirely different to tell us. Another textbook had the same kind of explanation. Dead animals sink to the seabed, and the remains are slowly buried by layers of sediment. The lower layers of sediment turn to rock, and the remains harden to form fossils. The rock is folded and eroded. The fossils are exposed on the surface. Here's another school textbook with a little more dogmatic statement. This is how an animal becomes a fossil. A fish living in prehistoric times. The fish dies and falls to the seafloor. It becomes a skeleton and is covered with layers of sediment. The mud turns to rock and wears away to show the fossil. Do you see any problems with this explanation? On that same page in that same textbook, these pictures are shown to give the student an idea that is actually a reasonable explanation of how to form fossils. Stir up some soil in a jam jar of water. Leave it to settle, and you will see it forms layers. But the students have been led along a path of logic that has missed some rather important things. Let's just rewind this thought and slow it down a bit. For instance, in this picture right here, could we just add a dead fish to this jam jar and expect it to eventually form a fossil? Sometimes I wonder if evolutionists ever go fishing. Number 1, when fish die, do they sink to the bottom? Number 2, even if they would sink to the bottom, would other animals leave them alone? The sediments on the bottom contain plenty of critters that would love to feast on a dead fish. And how much sediment would it have to be buried in to exclude the oxygen that normally causes something dead on the bottom to rot? Let's revisit that jam jar. If you actually do the experiment, about 95% of the sediment in that water will fall out in the first minute, and it'll take about a week for the water to clear up. And by now, I bet you can guess whether it's the 95% of the sediment or the 5% of the sediment on top that is the kind of sediment we find good fossils in. I have to remind you again that the theory of evolution was developed before evidence was collected to support it. So as evidence comes up that contradicts it, you have to continually adjust the theory. You may remember being told that animals with soft parts don't leave fossils at all. That's simply not true. Since the missing links the theory of evolution expected never showed up, this became an easy explanation for why not. But how consistent are evolutionists with these same explanations? The caption to this picture says the dinosaur Struthia minimus lies dead on a riverbank. For Struthia minimus to have a chance of fossilization, it must be buried quickly before it rots away. But then the magic happens. Buried under many layers of sediment over millions of years, the hard parts of Struthia minimus change to stony fossils. And still, much, much later, earth movement and erosion expose the skeleton at the surface. A scientist starts to chip away the surrounding rock. It is rare to find a perfectly preserved whole skeleton. Fossilization occurs mainly in silt or clay underwater. Wait a minute, we were just told this thing was on the riverbank. Do they mean that that's why this is so rare? Or is there another thought underlying this? An almost perfect fossil of Struthia minimus lying in its death pose has been carefully uncovered. Studying the skeleton gives scientists more clues in the dinosaur puzzle. Do you see any problems with this yet? Let's see if you've been paying attention. According to evolutionists, animals die for unknown reasons. Dead animals sink. Decay is slow. Predators leave the animal alone. Sediment covers the animal slowly, but the animal must be covered quickly and deeply. But to make fossils with a lot of detail like we find, you need very fine-grained sediment, like silver clay. Well-sorted sediment, all fine-grained. Lots of sediment, many feet to exclude oxygen and to discourage predators. A rush of sediment to bury animals that would normally float when they die. And add the fact that young, healthy animal fossils predominate over old, diseased animals in the fossil record.
Now, as someone who used to believe this theory from top to bottom, let me tell you how I would often feel when I would talk to a friend about the evolutionary view of biology. I'd walk away from that discussion and think, well, they would agree with me if they just had as much biology background as I do. Or if we talk about the geology aspect of evolutionary theory, and they wouldn't agree with me. When I'd walk away from that discussion, I would think, well, they would agree with me if they just had as much geology background as I have. But now, speaking as a former evolutionist, I have to say, evolution makes perfect sense until you think about it. And you can quote me. Let's take a quick look at some plant and animal fossils that we find and see if they hold up to the evolutionary scenarios. Here we have a very well preserved moth fossil. What kind of sediment? Very fine-grained and very well sorted. And think how fragile a moth's wings are. Here we have some fossil leaves. And to preserve soft leaf tissue like this requires what kind of sediment? Fine-grained, well-sorted sediment. Caption on this large fish is particularly well preserved, with no explanation whatsoever of how that could have been accomplished with any modern evolutionary scenario anyone has proposed. And pardon me for continuing to point this out. This is in fine-grained, well-sorted sediment, and a lot of it. Here's a fish fossil that recently came up for sale from the Green River Formation out west. And again, you can imagine the quality of the sediment and the fine-grained structure that it has to have give this detail to the fossil. Here you have a close-up of the fin section of that same fish, and then a close-up of the tail section. And you can see how fine-grained and well-sorted that sediment is that's given this kind of fossil detail. Here's a rather complete bird fossil that also came from the Green River Formation. Now, besides these aquatic animals and a few birds, it's also mentioned in the Wikipedia article that the Smithsonian Institution has more than 22 orders of insects that came from the Green River Formation. So how do evolutionists explain the formation of these extensive, fine-grained, well-sorted sediment beds? I'd like to encourage you to go out on Wikipedia and look up the Green River Formation and read the article for yourself. But I am going to read short portions of the article and paraphrase some of the geologic terms to make them more understandable. I really hope you can stay with me on this, because this is the explanation that critically examines why evolutionists and creationists can look at the same fossils and come up with vastly different interpretations. The physical geology of the lake sediments is varied and includes sandstones, mudstones, siltstones, oil shales, coal beds, evaporated mineral beds, and a variety of lake limestones and dolostones. Volcanic ash layers within the various sediments from the then active volcanic field to the north, in the vicinity of Yellowstone, and the San Juan volcanic field to the southeast provide datable layers within the sediments. Within the Green River Formation of southwest Wyoming, in the area known as Fossil Lake, two distinct zones of very fine-grained lime muds are particularly noted for preserving a variety of complete and detailed fossils. These layers are a lake Lagerstätte, a rare place where conditions were right for the rich accumulation of undisturbed fossils. The most productive zone, called the Split Fish Layer, consists of a series of laminated lime muds about 6 feet thick, which contain abundant fish and other fossils. These are easily split along the layers to reveal the fossils. This thin zone represents some 4,000 years of deposition. The second fossil zone, the 18-inch layer, is an unlaminated layer about 18 inches thick that also contains abundant detailed fossils, but it is harder to work because it is not composed of easily split rock. The limestone matrix is so fine-grained that fossils include rare soft parts of complete insects and fallen leaves in spectacular detail. The various fossil beds of the Green River Formation span a 5 million year period, dating to between 53.5 and 48.5 million years old. The climate was moist and mild enough to support crocodiles, which do not tolerate frost, and the lakes were surrounded by sycamore forests. As the lake configuration shifted, each Green River location is distinct in character and time. The lake system formed over underlying river deltas and shifted in the flat landscape with slight geological movements, receiving sediments from the highland and the Rocky Mountains to the east and to the north. The Lagerstätten formed in low oxygen conditions in the fine carbonate muds that formed in the lake beds. Lack of oxygen slowed bacterial decomposition and kept scavengers away, so leaves of palms, ferns, and sycamores, some showing the insect damage they had sustained during their growth, were covered with fine-grained sediment and preserved. Insects were preserved whole, even delicate wing membranes and spider spinnerets. Well, even I had to look up Lagerstätte. Lager meaning storage, Stati meaning place. It's a sedimentary deposit that exhibits extraordinary fossils with exceptional preservation, sometimes including preserved soft tissues. These formations may have resulted from carcass burial in an anoxic or low oxygen environment with minimal bacteria, thus delaying decomposition. I don't want to leave you with the impression that this German word Lagerstätte is only used for the Green River Formation. If you type in Lagerstätte fossils for sale on the internet, you will find that virtually every fossil formation all over the world that exhibits excellent fossils that are for sale has already been declared a Lagerstätte by someone. I need to move on, but I want to point out three things. Number one layer, the split fish layer, had laminated layers, which were interpreted as annual layers, and the 6 foot represented 4,000 years. But the similar 18-inch layer had no laminated layers, contained the same quality of fossils, and no interpretation was given as far as its age. And the same lakes that supported all this life had such a low oxygen content at the bottom that it allowed these plants and animals years of time to be slowly buried in fine-grained lake sediment without bacteria, scavengers, or even normal rot to disfigure them in any way, providing us with perfect fossils. This is just one more example of the just so explanations of evolution that are used to fit any new evidence that comes along into the theory. The theory is that flexible. So there you have it. Young, apparent healthy fish die for no apparent reason, and yet, by waving the magic wand of evolutionary interpretation, they're preserved as perfect fossils to completely support the view that this fossil formation represents long periods of time and nothing unusual, normal lake sediment. But yet again, we forgot one important fact about fossilizing dead fish in a lake environment. This is the point where I got off the evolutionary bandwagon 43 years ago, when I began to realize how absolutely ludicrous this kind of explanation for fossils was. This is when I began to say, evolution makes perfect sense, until you think about it. Now, these fossil fish from the Green River Formation are so abundant that they're relatively cheap, and some years ago when I was in Colorado, I purchased these 2 fossils for a total of less than $25. The one shown here is on about a 1/4-inch thick slab of stone, very fine-grained sediment, but no layers showing on the sides. It's a little hard to tell what this second fossil is, but it's actually 5 small fish piled on top of each other. So this first fossil would be from the 18-inch layer, and the second fossil would be from the split fish layer. The second one shown here is on about an 1/8 of an inch section of stone, but it has many layers and it has many other things interspersed throughout the layers. I recently showed these finds to 2 local fossil experts. The one on the left is totally awed by the quality of the fossil, and the one on the right is verifying my count of 5 small fish. Just went out on the internet and typed in Green River fossil fish for sale, and here's what I found. There are actually hundreds currently for sale. Here's a fossil fish with even better preservation of the tail and the trailing bottom fin. And one more time, the type of sediment, very fine-grained, well-sorted sediment. This is a fossil coelacanth. It is so well preserved that when a live one was first caught in 1938, it could be identified as identical to the fossil, and so making the ancient coelacanth species a living fossil. This is fairly coarse as fossil sediment goes, but it's still finer than sand. Notice the detail in the fins and the tail. Here's another fossil I had access to for many years from the same neighbor. And what kind of sediment is this? Well, by now you either understand why that's so important to this discussion, or you don't. 40 years ago, when I taught high school science, one of the students brought this in that they had saved since they were in junior high. The caption reads, "Millions of years ago, a perch made the mistake of trying to gulp a herring too big for the perch's mouth. The mistake cost the fish its life. It sank to the bottom of an ancient lake and became buried in the sediment. The sediment eventually turned to stone, and the fish became fossilized. The fish's poor judgment was uncovered by scientists searching for fossils in southwest Wyoming. The fossil is now in a Princeton University museum." So here, once again, we have the standard evolutionary explanation of what this sediment would look like today and where it would be found. But it completely begs the question of how this fossilization happened. And I, like millions of others, gullibly believed that this is how this happened and never bothered to think beyond the fact that it just didn't make sense. On display in the Smithsonian was this 7 to 8 foot long fish with another fish inside. This is not the actual fossil, but it's a duplicate of it. And it's in a white, marble-like limestone matrix, which is extremely fine-grained and extremely well-sorted sediment. And again, try to use the standard evolutionary explanation for fossils to figure out how you could fossilize this thing. Here's my favorite of all the pictures I took of fossils at the Smithsonian. The caption, "Herring, 50 million years old, from Wyoming." And yet here's a school of fish that it looks like somebody took a fossil snapshot of them as they were schooling. But how did this happen? And I don't think any of these fish can tell us when this happened. Fossils don't come with dates on them. There's a fossil bird called Archaeopteryx which has been found, and it has true feathers. So we get pictures in textbooks as Archaeopteryx having a scaly head. So we get artist drawings with captions like this: Archaeopteryx's head was covered with scaly skin like the dinosaurs. On the rest of its body, the scales had become feathers. Notice the evolutionary theory that dinosaurs became birds is not stated as theory, but as absolute fact. There are good reasons why reptiles have scales and birds have feathers, and neither has both. All this when one fossil hunter described what looked like scaly feathers on a bird that was covered elsewhere by real feathers. Remember that the theory came before the discovery, and the theory is flexible enough to tweak any amount of evidence in. Most evolutionists no longer believe this and now classify Archaeopteryx as a true bird and not a transitional form. Think this doesn't happen often? People my age will remember Dino from the Flintstones. The Brontosaurus of my youth had the wrong head. The head was found miles from the body in the original fossil. Later, a more complete fossil was found with a head. And that created a problem because this dinosaur had previously been discovered and named Apathosaurus. So the Brontosaurus got Plutoed, or demoted, and museums had to correct their displays. But as you've heard that pitchman say on TV, wait, there's more. And due to that self-correcting nature of science, once this was discovered, it was quickly corrected in the museums and all those textbooks, right? No. In fact, let me quote from NPR. Although the mistake was spotted by scientists by 1903, the brontosaurus lived on in movies, books, and children's imaginations. The Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh even topped its Apathosaurus skeleton with the wrong head in 1932. The apathy of the scientific community and a dearth of well-preserved Apathosaurus skulls kept it there for nearly 50 years. The Brontosaurus finally met its end in the 1970s when two Carnegie researchers took a second look at the controversy. They determined a skull found in a quarry in Utah in 1910 was the true Apathosaurus skull. In 1979, the correct head was placed atop the museum's skeleton. But as you've heard that pitchman say on TV, wait, there's more. This is out of a junior high textbook. Sometimes scientists make mistakes when they reconstruct dinosaurs. When they first discovered Iguanodon, they thought it had a horn on its nose. Later, they realized that Iguanodon had no horn, but a spike on each of its thumbs. Now scientists know more about dinosaurs and make fewer mistakes. Right. And out of that same series of junior high books, here's another one. So here's a fossil set of fish that appears to have been covered by sand after they died. And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to call this the caption for the gullible. This is a fossil of a group of fish which died when the lakes dried up. Their bodies are so well preserved that the fossils show the shape of their scales, which means that their bodies hadn't rotted at all while waiting on the sand to blow over and preserve them. Probably be a good time to remind you again that you've heard that things that have soft parts don't often make good fossils. Covering them with hot sand after they had died in a dried up lake would not accomplish this. But wait, there's more. Here's another fossil find where there were massive amounts of fish in what appeared to be lake sediment. And the explanation? Global warming. Here's the caption. About 375 million years ago, the weather became very hot. There were long seasons of drought, and the lakes and rivers dried up in the hot sun. Many fish died as the lake shrank. Their bodies lay on the sun-baked mud, and sand blew over them. It was so dry that the bodies did not rot away. Let's see if I understand that. That would mean that fish left out in the sun in Arizona won't rot because they have a dry heat down there. Sometimes in an effort to avoid the obvious and explain things to support evolution, you just get stupid. But wait, there's more. Out of another book. Dinosaurs were probably cold-blooded. That means that their body temperature was controlled by the heat of the sun. If the weather was cool, the dinosaurs got cold. But some of the dinosaurs were so big that it took a very long time to cool. Their great size kept them warm, and this was probably one of the reasons they were so big. What? Do we really think this would help them survive a winter, or more than a day or two of cold? What if they got cold before they were big enough? What about the babies?
One of the newest areas in the battlefield between evolution and creation has been the finding of soft tissues in what was otherwise considered to be a fossilized animal. Normally, the use of the word fossils infers that all the material has been replaced by minerals. Evolutionary thought was that fossils were way too old to still contain soft tissue. Cases where soft tissue was found were dismissed as contamination or even outright fraud. Instances of verified soft tissue examples in ancient fossils now numbers over 50 instances, with more being found all the time. Here are just a few of the examples. The find is on the left, and the evolutionary age in millions of years is on the right. Skin has been found on an ichthyosaur. That's a reptile that I will be finishing my presentation with. Unfossilized ink has been found in a squid fossil. Soft tissue has been found in an Archaeopteryx fossil, At one time, Archaeopteryx was considered a transitional form between reptiles and birds, but it is now universally considered as an early bird with full feathers. Dated as one of the oldest, a shrimp, shell, and unfossilized mussel were found. And of course, one of the ones that's gotten the most publicity is a Tyrannosaurus rex find with soft tissue in the blood vessels. And intact bacteria have been found in a variety of mineral deposits. One creationist, Mark Armitage, was even fired by Cal State Northridge because he chose to privately state that his find of soft tissue in a Triceratops horn meant that the fossil could not be as old as it has been dated by evolutionary methods. He sued the college for religious discrimination and won the lawsuit. But now that the existence of soft tissue in fossils has become more commonplace, evolutionists have worked to explain how it is possible for soft tissues to be preserved over these vast ages. Some of these explanations have shown how soft tissue deterioration can be slowed, and most evolutionary scientists in the field have been satisfied with these initial explanations. But the simplest explanation remains that these soft tissues and the fossils that contain them are not nearly as old as evolutionists would have us to believe.
And finally, the marine reptile named Ichthyosaur. We believe they were reptiles, which means they breathed air. They were shaped somewhat like dolphins, but dolphins are not reptiles. And fossils of the adults range from about 6 feet to almost 30 feet. Recently, this fossil of the vertebrae of a larger ichthyosaur came up for sale. Also, one of the ichthyosaurs from Germany, very similar to the one at the top, came up for sale as well. If you have $45,000 to spare, you can put it on your wall. This is a photograph of one of the first very large ichthyosaurs ever found in Germany. And again, point out, large animal in fine-grained, well-sorted sediment, fine-grained enough to show the details of even the flesh, detailed enough that scientists were able to discover an unborn baby inside the mother. Another ichthyosaur fossil with a newborn beside it, and an unborn baby still inside of it. Here we have an individual of well over 5 feet in length, an apparently healthy mother who had just given birth. Scientists simply commented that something killed the mother between the time she had the first baby and before she could have the other. Here again, evolutionists completely skirt the issue. Not how she died, but how did she get fossilized with her newborn? Information on a Chinese ichthyosaur fossil was just released in printed articles in February 2014 in a wide variety of sources. But the spin that came with the find was astounding. The 248-million-year-old fossil reveals an ichthyosaur baby inside its mother, and another stuck in her pelvis. A third embryo discovered nearby suggests it was stillborn. Scientists believe the mother died during a difficult labor. One in, one half out. It's not just the age of the discovery that's surprising, it's the shattering of the belief that ichthyosaurs gave birth in water, not on land. The scientists reached their conclusion because the fossil showed the offspring emerging head first, a behavior found only in animals that give birth on land. Since ichthyosaurs evolved first on land before becoming aquatic, some of the first species to live in water, such as Ichthyosaurs, were still giving birth as their ancestors had. Notice how dogmatic all these statements are, as if the scientists had already been there. And maybe I've been doing this too long, but I've just gotten a little bit tired of this. Because you see, I've had the following slide for over 40 years. And by this same logic, I guess breech births in humans would tell us something about our ancestry. And my last fossil slide is this one, a fossil that captures the moment that an ichthyosaur was giving birth. I'm going to paraphrase the caption to this find that you'll see here on the screen. Fossils show that the ichthyosaurs gave birth to live young. The female above was killed by some calamity while giving birth. May I present to you that some calamity is one of the greatest understatements you will ever see anywhere. These fossils, the very rocks, still cry out to all who will listen. Let's compare these two theories and see whose faith best fits the scientific evidence. Evolutionists say that fossils prove evolution by showing the simple to complex progression predicted. Fossilization is relatively rare, explaining why there are gaps in the record. Fossils, like cards, can be stacked into a deck to show how life evolved on Earth. Fossils' vast ages show how old the Earth is and how long evolution has been working. And that is certainly one way to interpret the evidence. Creationists say that quality fossils are found in fine-grained, well-sorted sediment that requires large amounts of sediment and very large quantities of water. Conditions like that are difficult or impossible to even duplicate today. The best explanation for most fossil formations is a one-time, global, cataclysmic event, the flood of Noah's day. And the implications of that, if it were true, is that the plants and animals found in the fossil record were alive on the Earth at the same time and do not represent different ages at all. And that is a striking contrast. And that would mean that the vast ages of evolution never existed at all. But that's a topic for another film. But the theme of this presentation is that evolution cannot explain how the fossils were formed at all. I have never quoted a lot of scripture in my presentations, even when I do it in churches, but I've always focused on this portion of scripture when I talk about the fossils. 2 Peter 3:3-9. Knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lusts, and saying, Where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. For this they willingly are ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in the water, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. But the heavens and the earth, which are now, by the same word are kept in store, reserved unto fire, against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. But, beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, but is longsuffering to usward, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. What will you do with the time he's given you?
To discuss this video or any other topic in applied science, here is my contact information. I'd be glad to hear from you at any time. The end. Thank you for watching.